Welcome, everyone. Welcome, David. Thank you for accepting this invitation. Um, I am Miriam from Culture of Peace News Network that works with Culture of Peace and is organizing this event. We're sorry that we had this problem with YouTube, and we're doing our best to solve it. I'll, uh, So please subscribe to our channel here on YouTube, and I will record this and we'll upload there as well. And if you want to know more about our organization, you can enter. I will put here on the chat. It's cpnn-world.org. And first of all, we would like to acknowledge the suffering that is happening in the world with COVID-19. There's a lot of people suffering, we know that, with their families, jobs, also the healthcare and economic system. And we know that in times like this, there are a lot of questions, and that is why we invited Dr. David Adams to talk with us. We're going to talk about Pieces in Our Hands, Culture of Peace as a Path in Times of Crisis. And I'll present our guest, Dr. David Adams. He's an American peace activist, a scientist, scholar, writer. He wrote many books and journalist. And as a professor at Wesleyan University, he ran a brain research laboratory and published many scientific articles. Adams then served at UNESCO, where he worked with Culture of Peace initiative, and then eventually led to the International Year for the Culture of Peace. He also helps a lot of civil organizations, and he's acting a lot for Culture of Peace. So David, thank you again. Welcome everyone that is here with us. And I have some questions for you, then we will open for questions for who might have questions. How the events of now as COVID-19 and emerging crisis impact us in the present? How do you see that?
Well, the economic crash is being blamed on the coronavirus. But actually, the economic crash has been in preparation for many years because the world has been spending its resources on the military instead of on things which we need. For example, now we need hospitals and medical supplies and doctors. But the money that went into the military budget was taken away from education and healthcare and other services. The other thing that is prepared for this crash is that for many years now, the financial institutions have speculated with money. They speculate every day more money than the world actually produces in a full year. This is called the overburdened economy by a very good economist, Lloyd Dumas, who wrote about this 20 years ago. And he showed how money that goes into the military is money that's taken away from the rest of the budget for people's needs. This is why the Soviet Union crashed in 1989, because it devoted twice as much of its economy to the military as its enemies in the West, and so it crashed. Now in 1980, Johann Galtung, who was a very famous peace researcher, predicted that the Soviet Union would crash in 10 years. And in fact, it crashed in 9 years. But Galtung says the same thing has happened with the United States. And in 2005, he said the United States will crash in 15 years, and he was right exactly. The year 2020, he predicted in the year 2005, and that's where we are today. However, that's the bad news. Now, the good news is that a crash is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to change the system completely, radically. An opportunity to turn from the culture of war that has been developed for thousands of years to a new culture, a culture of peace, a culture the world has never yet seen.
So by saying that, what is your vision about the future in a new possible world? What would you tell us about it?
I had the fortune to be at UNESCO during the 1990s, and we developed a vision for the culture of peace. And that vision has stayed with me to this day. I was lucky at that time that the head of UNESCO was Federico Mayor, who believed that the United Nations should make peace and not war. And so during that time, we developed national culture of peace programs in a number of countries. And then we were named by the United Nations to do the International Year for the Culture of Peace. And Mr. Mayor gave me the responsibility to manage the International Year. And we've created, at that time, a vision of the culture of peace. We asked people to sign up with the Manifesto 2000, and 1% of planet Earth, 75 million people signed up to make a culture of peace in their homes, in their communities, in their workplaces. And at the same time, we were asked by the United Nations in New York to make a declaration and a program of action of how to go from the culture of war to a culture of peace. And so later on, I can describe to you in detail what we put into this declaration, which was our vision of a culture of peace.
Nice. And could you explain, because I think not everybody here knows about culture of peace and what it means. So I think it would be really nice to share your perspective. That for me is really inspiring and easy to understand.
Well, it's the perspective that went into the United Nations Declaration. It's called A53-243, which was passed on the last day of the session in 1999 for the International Year for the Culture of Peace by the General Assembly in New York. Now, when we were asked to write this declaration, we said nobody knows what is a culture of peace, but we do know what is a culture of war. And so we started by describing very carefully what is the culture of war. Well, everybody knows, of course, the tip of the iceberg, which is military forces, rockets, nuclear weapons, all soldiers, all that goes into the military budget. But that's just the tip of an iceberg. And we described 7 other aspects of the culture of peace, which is part of that culture which makes war possible. First of all, there has never been a war without an enemy. So a big part of the culture of war is to invent the enemy. There was a very interesting example of this in 1989, I think it was, no, 1986, when Gorbachev and Reagan met in Iceland to end the Cold War. And Gorbachev said to Reagan, I'm going to do something very bad for you. I'm going to take away your enemy. And there was panic in Washington. How can we justify the military budget and the military industrial complex if we have no enemy? And so they gave the task to a professor at Harvard who was working with the CIA named Samuel Huntington. And he wrote an article for the Foreign Affairs, I think it was, big journal of the American, associated with the American State Department, in which he said, we have found the enemy and it is Islam. And since that time, the United States has considered that Islam is the enemy and the Islamic countries. But that's just a second thing. Why has the culture of war been so successful for so many centuries, for thousands of years? Simply because it enables exploitation. It enables the rich countries to exploit the poor countries. It enabled slavery first, then it enabled colonialism, and now that's neocolonialism. That's why it's so profitable. There are studies that show that the net flow of resources from the south to the north is far greater than anyone talks about, because it's done secretly and illegally by corporations who, instead of paying taxes to the countries in the south, they transfer funds secretly into accounts elsewhere. So exploitation is part of the culture of war. Exploitation of people and exploitation of the environment. We see that the environment has been destroyed by the military everywhere. There are parts of the world which are uninhabitable because of nuclear wastes. Another aspect of the culture of war is secrecy and control of information. In fact, I think this is the most important part of the culture of war today, is its control of information, because people don't want to go to war. They have to be convinced. And so governments convince people that they need to go to war. Right now, we see that with Trump trying to convince people that he needs to make a war with Venezuela, for example. So secrecy and control of information. Another thing is that the culture of war is masculine. It's patriarchy. It's men. Because from the beginning of time, men have controlled war and women have been excluded. There are exceptions, of course, but in general, the culture of war is male dominated. Finally, the culture of war is authoritarian. People have to follow orders if there's to be a war. And so, given all these aspects of the culture of war, the entire iceberg, we put into the declaration the opposite. Instead of military, disarmament. Instead of enemy images, solidarity and universal understanding. Instead of patriarchy and male domination, equality of women and men. Instead of authoritarian structures, democratic participation. And finally, education for a culture of peace. Oh no, but I must not forget. Instead of the exploitation, we need sustainable development, sustainable, equitable development. So that's the vision of the culture of peace, which was adopted by the United Nations in a very, very important declaration. I think it's as important as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Thank you. So I really like this image of the iceberg that as you say, that culture, that war is just the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg in whole is culture of war, and culture of peace is the whole iceberg, and peace is just the tip of the iceberg. And a lot of people misunderstand that, and we are still understanding and creating this space. And I really like when you say about the women, that it's needed a balance, and women in leadership positions and a more feminine way of leading the world. And thank you for that. As a woman, I would like to thank you for that. And how can culture of peace be linked, do you think, with the future that we want to create, with the future as a future, and what are the steps we could take?
Well, first of all, I have to go back to what happened in the year 2000 with the International Year for the Culture of Peace. When we sent the declaration from UNESCO to the General Assembly, all of the big countries were against it. The European Union said, you cannot talk about a culture of war at the United Nations. It's forbidden, because the delegate from the European Union said there is no culture of war. So we can't talk about it. And the funniest was the American delegate. He said, well, if we have a human right to peace, it's going to be more difficult for us to start a war, so it's not good. It turns out that whereas individuals have human rights, the states consider that their fundamental right of the state, is to make war. So although we had mobilized 75 million people in the year 2000, the United States and the European Union sent in a new boss for me. And he came to me and he said, my job is to shut you down. And so they stopped the whole Culture of Peace project because they don't want peace. I was very shocked. I really did not expect that. And so not only was I retired from UNESCO, but they made a special note in the office in New York of UNESCO that I was not allowed to enter the office because I wanted to continue working, but no. And so to understand this, I spent several years to write a history of the culture of war. And what I found in this history, which is online, by the way, anybody can read it on my website, History of the Culture of War. What I found is very simple, is that over the course of 2,000, 5,000 years, the state has come to monopolize violence. No one else is allowed to kill except the state. Only the state has armies. Only the state can have capital punishment. And no one else, whether it's small cities or whether it's indigenous peoples, no one else is allowed to make war. Only the state. And so the obstacle for the culture of peace is the nation state. And we have to begin now to understand that we need a transition from the United Nations, which is run by nation states, to a United Nations that is run by the people. And I think the best way is to have the Security Council run by mayors of the world, for example, because mayors don't need nuclear weapons. They don't need armies. They don't need wars. They need to produce for the people of their cities and their regions.
Thank you very much. Well, we have some questions.
Maybe I should make one more thing, just to link now to go back to the question of the crash being an opportunity. The crash is an opportunity now to pass from the dominance of the UN by the nation state to a new United Nations, which is run by the people. The crash is our opportunity to do that because the big countries are ignoring the UN now. They don't want the UN. And it's left for the people to take over. A good example of that was this week when the President of the United States said they would no longer give money to the World Health Organization, which is part of the UN, because the big countries, they don't want the UN anymore. Okay, you have questions, yeah.
They have questions. Our guests have questions, and yeah, and we have it's really important that we take space and we're occupying these spaces and sharing information that comes, because we have a lot of fake news as well, and we have a lot of controlling, as you said. And so we have some questions here from our guests. One of the questions from Sen, it's asking, it's time to cooperation. In my city, a lot of people don't respect none of the advice to stay home. And what is your tip for people to stay home? What would you say to them? And is there a way to turn the mindset of a big number of people, especially the stubborn ones? Thank you.
Well, I think this broadcast, even though we have some technical difficulties, is an example of a new world where all the people of the world can be connected by communication. And we can begin, and instead of watching our television sets with the mass media, which is linked to the culture of war, we can begin to make our own news. That's what we do on the Culture of Peace News Network, cpnnworld.org. Every day there's a new article about what's happening for peace in the world. And here we're beginning to have webinars where we can work together. So I think this is the way of the future. And people can stay home and stay on the internet.
Yeah, it's important so we can take care of everyone. And ATL Peace, you can say, so he's here by my side. I don't know if he's by my side here with you, but ATL Peace is asking, Dr. Adams, what do you think about the new US government department, Space Force? What do you think about that?
It's business as usual for the military-industrial complex. There will be huge military contracts for companies to put things in space that are dangerous. It's just, it's more of the same. We need to change the system completely. There's no excuse for this.
And I don't know if I will pronounce it correctly, Timara? I think I mispronounced it, but you're muted. Do you want to say your name?
Hi, it's Tamara. It's so close. Perfect.
Tamara.
Yeah.
Tamara?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because I tend to be an idealist and an optimist, and I'm, someone who likes to take action. I'm inspired by people like everybody who's on the video conference right now. But the notion that the people would take over the United Nations from the big countries seems a bit daunting. And, I love it, but how would that occur? Like, what are the steps that need to happen for that? And it's so disappointing and disheartening that the United Nations, to me, when I think about it, is supposed to be this organization that inspires, hope and peace, but it's not. And how do we take it over? That's what I'm just curious to know. Some ideas.
Shall I respond, Miriam?
What? Sorry.
Miriam, should I respond? Okay.
Thank you.
I have a blog, which I think we can give the blog later. And I've been talking now for a couple of years about a plan to take over the United Nations, which begins by having what I call the Mayor's Security Council. That the big mayors of the big cities of the world should be linked together, and every time something happens in the world, they should issue the statements about what they would do if they were running the Security Council of the United Nations, a Mayor's Security Council. And of course, the first thing they would do would be to get rid of nuclear weapons, because they don't need nuclear weapons. And this would, if we can put this on the media everywhere, the Mayor's Security Council and what they are saying this week, it will prepare people to believe that there's another world is possible, that we could have the Security Council run by mayors. That's an example. But I go into a lot of examples like this in a little book called I Have Seen the Promised Land, which I wrote 12 years ago, I wrote it, in which I predicted the crash for the year 2020. And then it goes on for another 6 years to say how we would go to take over the UN. And there's a lot of details of ideas in that book. But one of them is to begin with the Mayor's Security Council.
Thank you. We have put the link here for the website, and I have all of your emails, and we can send to you as well. ATL Peace is asking, he's saying, Dr. Adams, 2019 was Gandhi's 150th birth anniversary, and in 1930 he started The Future is with Women. Is there a greater hope for a brighter future due to women rising up into more leadership?
Certainly that's part of it, yes. I like very much, for example, the website of the Nobel Women's Initiative, in which many women have won the Nobel Peace Prize, and they have their own website in which they give us advice. That's a good example.
And how to reconcile actions in favor of a culture of peace and economic stress related to social isolation, social distancing? It's a question from Elizabeth Ferroni.
One of the things that is going to be necessary is that we develop institutions that are independent of the nation state, because it's the nation state is the problem, and we need to go around it. So we need more and more local initiatives, and I think this is happening. Where I'm living here in France, there are more and more people who are getting their produce directly from farms instead of going to the supermarkets. And we are having more and more cases where there's not even any money involved. You go to the farm, and you bring with you something that you have produced to give to the farmer, and he gives you what he has done, or she. And that's, in French, that's called troc, or exchange, just direct exchange. And I think this is the kind of thing. There are more and more farmers markets, and we need local peace initiatives, local peace committees, not state, but each city should have its peace commission, for example. And we need to develop a whole series of local institutions to replace the state.
We have a time for last question, if you want to ask any other questions. And she's saying, think global, act locally. There's a comment here from City People's World Host that's saying that he's appreciating you, Dave, your effort today and throughout your life in working for a culture of peace, and thanking me as well for the organization. I didn't organize it alone. I organized it with Herbert as well, that he is working here with the technologies and with other board members from CPNN that you can also. Oh, and I would also like to invite you that if you see any news around the world about culture of peace, you can share it with us in our website, because the idea from CPNN is to spread news of culture of peace around the world that is happening, so we can more and more have more news. Because if we look, and this was something that David taught me, is that if we look to the whole scenario, we have 8% of news, 90% of the news there is more in culture of war, and we need to bring balance and have more culture of peace news. So you can contribute with that, and here's our invitation for you to be part of it. Any other questions you might have?
And I have a question. When do we meet again?
When do we meet again? So probably in 1 month, and we are providing, trying to provide, because there are a lot of Brazilians that are participating and they asked for simultaneously translation. And we might have it for the next time. And you're more than welcome to join and invite other people so we can spread the news and start to organize a hub of culture of peace and find strategies to bring to our countries and to act in our cities as well. As David said, it's really important to do locally so we can reach globally. Clap, clap, clap. Thank you, guys. Yes, we need more meetings, and we will send to you CPNN, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you all for coming. David, thank you so much for accepting this invitation and for all your knowledge and everything you bring to us. Would you have a last message that you would like to give to us in culture of peace or life?
I like the message that someone gave to us to think global, act local.
Nice. Thank you all. I'll send you the recorded video and see you soon in our next meeting. Bye. Kisses and hugs from Brazil. And other Brazilians here as well, and all people around the world.
Ciao, obrigada. Bye bye.
We can all, if you want, we have this time, and if everybody want to turn on and say bye, so David can and I can hear all your voices. It's good.
Bye bye. Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
See you soon.
Alla prochaine.
Voilà. Hey Dave, I'm quiet here inside, but here, okay?
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Bye.
Bye from Atlanta, City of Peace.
Ciao.
Ciao.